Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The sea of mist stretched endlessly before them, a thick blanket of fog that swallowed the horizon. It was said that no one who ventured into the mist ever returned, that the sea itself consumed those who dared to seek the treasure hidden within. But Captain Jack stood at the helm of his ship, the storm rider staring into the fog with a determination that bordered on madness. Jack wasn't T like the others who had come before him. He wasn't just another pirate looking for gold or glory. No, for Jack, the treasure was more than a legend. It was a promise. A promise that had kept him alive through years of plundering and battle. He clenched the worn leather-bound map in his hand, its edges frayed from years of youth. The symbols on it were faded, but Jack didn't need to see them clearly anymore. He knew every line, every mark by heart. We were close. Now Jack murmured to himself, though. The words did little to ease the knot of tension in his chest. Behind him, the crew moved about the deck, their faces etched with the same mixture of fear and excitement that Jack had felt the first time he heard the stories about the Sea of Mist. Most of them had never sailed into these waters before. Hell, most of them wouldn't have if they hadn't been promised the kind of riches that could buy entire kingdom. Jack's sea first mate, Henry, approached, his boots thudding heavily against the wooden deck. Henry had been with Jack for years through countless battles and storms. He was a large man, with a grizzled beard and arms that looked like they could wrestle a bear to the ground. But even Henry looked uneasy as he stared out at the mist. "Captain, the men are nervous," Henry said, his voice low so that the others wouldn't see or more than nervous. "Some are talking about turning back." Jack glanced at Henry, his jaw tightening. "Harry, and what do you say, Henry? Are you nervous?" Henry hesitated, then nodded. "I'd be a fool not to be, but I've followed you through worse, Captain." Turn his attention back to the myth. "Good, because there ain't no turning back. We find that treasure, or we don't plan come back at all." Henry didn't respond, but Jack could feel the tension between them. It wasn't just the mist or the stories. It was something deeper, something that had been building since the moment they set sail. Jack knew that some of the crew had begun to doubt him. They whispered behind his back, questioning his obsession with the treasure, wondering if it was worth the risk. But Jack didn't care. He had his reasons they couldn't begin to understand. As the ship sailed further into the mist, the world around them seemed to vanish. The sea grew still, the wind died down, and the thick fog pressed in on them like a living thing. The only sound was the creaking of the ship's timbers and the occasional cough or muttered curse from the crew. Jack's grip tightened on the wheel as he steered the ship into the unknown. His thoughts drifted back to the day he first heard about the treasure, the day he lost everything. It had been years ago, but the memory was as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. The shipwreck, the storm, the screams of his crew as they were swallowed by the sea. And then nothing but the cold, dark water and the silence that followed. Jack had survived, though he didn't know how, and when he washed up on shore, barely alive, it was the old man who had found him. The old man with the map that promised everything Jack had lost could be regained, if only he had the courage to sail into the mist and claim the treasure. Land ho! A shout from the crow's nest broke Jack from his thought. He squinted through the mist and saw it, a dark shape looming in the distance. An island, just as the map had said. His heart raced, but he kept his face calm. The crew needed to believe he was in control, that he knew what he was doing, even if he wasn't so sure anymore. The ship glided toward the island, the mist swirling around them like ghosts. Jack called for the anchor to be dropped, and the ship lurched to a stop. The crew gathered on deck, their faces pale and drawn. Jack could see the fear in their eyes, but he also saw something else. Greed, the promise of treasure, had lured them here, just as it had lured him, but he knew that greed could turn dangerous. "Listen up," Jack's voice cut through the murmur of the crew. "We've come too far to turn back. Now the treasure is here on this island. But the mist, it plays tricks. Dawn, trust what you see. Don't trust anyone but me. We stick together and we'll all get what we came for, split up, and you will be dead before you know it." The crew nodded, though Jack could see the doubt flickering in their eye. They were loyal for now, but loyalty had a way of vanishing when gold was on the line. Jack led the way as they lowered the rowboats and made their way to the island. The sand was cold beneath their boots, and the air smelled of salt and decay. The island was small, barely more than a rock jutting out of the sea, but it felt alive with a strange energy. Jack could feel it pulsing beneath his skin, calling to him. They made their way inland, through twisted trees and jagged rock. The fog hung heavy in the air, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The crew stayed close, their hands on their weapons, eyes darting nervously to the shadow. "Captain, you sure about this?" One of the men, a young deckhand named Finn, whispered as he fell and stepped beside Jack. Jack didn't answer. He wasn't sure about anything anymore, but he couldn't show weakness. Not now. They pressed on deeper into the island. The mist seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as they approached a clearing. In the center stood a stone altar covered in moss and vines, and on the altar a chest. The treasure. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He had found it. After all these years, all the sacrifice, it was finally within his grasp. But as he stepped toward the chest, something shifted in the mist. Shadows moved, figures emerging from the fog. Jack's hand went to his sword, and the crew followed suit, weapons drawn. Out of the mist came a ship, a ghostly pirate vessel, its tattered sails billowing in a wind that didn't exist. The crew on board were nothing but skeletal remains, their empty eye sockets glowing with an eerie green light. "Back to the boats," Jack shouted, but it was too late. The ghost ship fired its cannons, the sound like a thunderclap in the silence. The blast tore through the clearing, sending men flying. Jack hit the ground hard, his ears ringing, the taste of blood in his mouth. Chaos erupted as the crew scrambled to defend themselves. Jack could barely make sense of what was happening. The ghostly pirates swarmed them, their bony hands grasping at anything they could reach. Jack swung his sword, cutting down one after another, but it was like fighting smoke. For every pirate he killed, two more appeared. The mist was alive with the sounds of battle swords clashing, men screaming, the haunting laughter of the dead. Jack fought his way toward the chest, his mind focused on one thing, the treasure. If he could just get to it, maybe he could stop this nightmare. But when he reached the altar, the chest was gone. Jack's heart sank. The treasure, the one thing he had sacrificed everything for, had vanished into the mist. Captain Ya's voice cut through the chaos, and Jack turned to see his first mate struggling to fend off a group of ghostly pirates. Jack sprinted toward him, cutting through the undead with brutal efficiency. Together, they fought their way back to the rowboats, barely escaping with their lives. The ghost ship lingered in the mist, its crew watching them with those empty, glowing eyes as the storm rider sailed away. As the island disappeared into the fog, Jack stood at the helm, his heart heavy. The treasure was gone, and with it, the last hope of reclaiming what he had lost. The sea of mist had taken everything from him, just as it had taken everyone else who dared to seek its secret. But as the mist began to lift, revealing the open sea ahead, Jack realized that perhaps it wasn't treasure he needed after all. He still had his ship, his crew, and the open ocean before him, and that was enough for now. The fog lifted just enough to reveal the open sea ahead, but the weight in Jack's chest didn't lift with it. He stood at the helm of the Storm Rider, his hand resting on the worn wood of the wheel, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The crew was quiet, their faces drawn and pale, still shaken from the battle with the ghost ship. They had escaped the island, but the cost had been too high. Henry approached, his face grim. He had a gash across his forehead, and his left arm hung limp at his side, but he was still standing. "We lost 5 men," he said quietly, as if the words might not sting as much if spoken softly, Finn saw him. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, swallowing the bitter taste of failure. Finn had been young, full of hope and ambition. He had followed Jack into the mist, trusting him to lead them to riches beyond their wildest dreams, and now he was gone, along with so many others. "It's my fault." Jack muttered his breath, though. He wasn't sure if Henry had heard him, or if the words had been meant for anyone but himself. Henry shook his head, his eyes dark with worry, concurrently. "We all knew the risks, Captain. This place, it ain't natural. The men, they were scared, and I don't truly blame them. We need to turn back, get as far from this cursed place as we can." Jack gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. Near where? Henry, back to the same ports, the same lives. What do we have to show for it? Henry frowned, a deep line creasing his forehead. "3 of our lives isn't that enough." Jack didn't answer. He couldn't. The truth was, it wasn't enough. Not for him. He had spent years chasing this dream, this treasure that had promised to fix everything. He had sacrificed everything, his crew, his sanity, his soul, all for a chest that had disappeared like a mirage in the mist. The mist had played its final trick on him, and now there was nothing left. Henry hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was close enough to hear. Some of the men, they were talking about mutiny. Jack stiffened, but he wasn't too surprised. He'd felt the tension growing ever since they set sail for the Sea of Mist. The crew had followed him for the promise of gold and riches beyond their wildest dream. But now, with the treasure gone, and the cost of the journey becoming painfully clear, that loyalty was hanging by a thread. Let them try. Jack said coldly, I'll throw the first one who raises a hand overboard. Henry C's face hardened. It's so, not just about the treasure.
Captain.
They think this place is cursed. They think UV led them into a death trap. Jack's jaw clenched. Maybe they're right? The words hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Henry didn't reply, and after a moment, he turned and walked back to the crew, leaving Jack alone at the helm. For the first time in his life, Jack didn't know what to do. He had always been so sure, so confident in his ability to lead, to fight, to win. But now he wasn't sure of anything. The mist had taken everything from him. His crew, his treasure, his hope. Jack glanced down at the map, the worn and faded parchment that had led him here. It was useless, now just a collection of lines and symbols that had lost their meaning. With a bitter laugh, Jack crumpled the map in his hand and tossed it into the sea. He was done with the treasure, done with the mist, done with everything. But the sea wasn't done with him. As the crumpled map hit the water, the mist around them began to shift. It moved like a living thing, swirling and coiling around the ship, tightening its grip. The crew stirred, their eyes wide with fear as the fog thickened once more, obscuring the horizon. Captain, one of the men shouted, his voice cracking with panic. Do you miss it? Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the thickening fog. The ghost ship, it was coming for them again. He could feel it, like a cold hand pressing against his spine. Ready the cannons, Jack barked, his voice cutting through the rising panic. Yuri, everyone, to your station. The crew scrambled to obey, but Jack could see the terror in their eye. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and they knew it, but they had no choice. It was fight or die. The mist swirled thicker, darker, and then through the veil of fog, Jack saw it. The ghost ship, its tattered sails billowing in the windless air, its skeletal crew, silently watching from the deck. Their eyes glowed with that eerie green light, and Jack knew they were waiting for the kill. Fire, Jack shouted, and the cannons roared to life, sending a volley of cannonballs into the mist. But the ghost ship would flinch. The cannonballs passed right through it as if it were nothing but smoke. Damn it, Jack cursed, his mind racing. There had to be a way to stop them, to break whatever curse held these ghosts in the mist. But what the treasure was gone, the chest vanished. What more could the mist want? And then it hit him. The mist had never wanted the treasure, it had wanted them. It had wanted their fear, their greed, their desperation. The treasure was just a lure, a trap to bring them here, and now that they were caught, the mist would never let them go. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the terrible truth. They were never going to escape, not unless they gave the mist what it wanted. Henry, Jack called, his voice hoarse. Get the men back to the rowboats we were leaving. Henry looked at him like he was mad. What we can to row our way out of this, Captain, that ship. It's not the ship, Jack said, his voice low and urgent. Fleet sent the myth. It's feeding off of us, off our fear, our greed. We have to leave everything behind, everything. Henry's eyes widened as the realization dawned on him. You mean? Yes, Jack said, grimly. The crew balked at the idea, but Jack knew it was the only way. The mist wanted them to fight, to hold on to the ship, the treasure their lives. But if they gave it up, if they gave everything up, they might just have a chance. It was a gamble, the biggest one Jack had ever made, but he had nothing left to lose. One by one, the crew climbed into the rowboats, their faces pale with fear. They left everything behind, food, supplies, weapons. The ship creaked and groaned as they abandoned it like a dying animal, watching its last breath slip away. Jack was the last to leave, standing at the helm one final time, staring into the swirling mist. The ghost ship loomed closer, its skeletal crew silent and still watching him. For a moment, Jack wondered if this was it, if this was how it ended. But then, as the last rowboat pulled away from the storm rider, something changed. The mist hid. The ghost ship began to fade, its tattered sails dissolving into the air. The green glow in the skeleton's eyes flickered and died, and then just like that, the ship was gone. The fog lifted completely, revealing the open sea. His heart pounding, they had done it, they had survived. But as the storm rider disappeared behind them, swallowed by the sea, Jack knew that he had left more than just his ship behind. He had left behind the man. He once was the pirate captain who had been willing to sacrifice everything for treasure that never existed. As the sun rose over the horizon, bathing the sea in golden light, Jack closed his eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath. The sea of mist had taken everything from him, and it had given him something in return. Freedom. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the calm waters as the rowboats drifted away from the sea of mist. Jack sat at the back of the boat, his hands resting on the oars, though he hadn't rowed in some time. He stared at the open horizon, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The crew had grown silent in the hours since they had left the storm rider behind, their faces drawn and pale with exhaustion. Even Henry, who had always been the most stalwart among them, looked like a man broken by the journey. They had escaped the mist, but Jack knew that they would never be the same.
The fog may have lifted, but it had left its mark on them, an invisible scar that they would carry with them for the rest of their lives.
Jack leaned back against the side of the boat, the cool sea air brushing against his face. He tried to clear his mind, to let go of the tension that had built up in his chest, but it lingered, like a splinter too deep to reach. The sea of mist had taken everything he thought he wanted, everything he thought he needed to be whole again. It had shown him the treasure, dangled it in front of him, only to pull it away at the last moment, leaving him with nothing but his life. He thought of Finn, of the others who had followed him into the mist and never returned. He thought of their hopes, their dreams, all lost in that swirling fog. And he thought of his own dreams, the ones that had driven him to the edge of madness. The treasure had promised to bring his family back, to undo the terrible things that had happened to him all those years ago. But now, in the quiet aftermath of the journey, Jack realized how foolish that had been. Nothing could bring them back. No treasure, no magic. Some things were simply lost, and no amount of gold or power could change that. Captain Henry's voice cut through his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. Jack looked over at him. Henry's eyes were filled with concern, but also something else. Something Jack hadn't seen in a long time. Respect, the kind of respect that came from seeing a man survive the impossible. "What is it?" Jack asked, his voice rough from the hours of silence. "We're low on supplies," Henry said, glancing at the other boat. "We can row much longer without food or fresh water." The men there hanging on, but barely. Jack nodded. He knew the situation was dire, but he also knew that they had made it this far. Somehow they would make it a little farther. "There's land ahead," Jack said, though he wasn't sure if it was a promise or a hope. "We'll find food and water soon." Henry didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. He knew better than to challenge Jack's resolve, especially now when the crew needed anything to believe it. The hours passed in silence, the rhythm of the oars dipping into the water, the only sound to fill the stilled air. Jack's muscles ached with each stroke, his body screaming for rest, but he kept going. He had no choice. The men were counting on him, and after everything they had been through, he wasn't going to let them down. It was just before dusk when they spotted it, a dark shape on the horizon, faint but unmistakable. Land, real land, not the cursed island they had left behind. Jack felt a flicker of hope, sparked to life inside him, something he hadn't earned to felt in days. The crew stirred at his words, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten as they turned to see the distant shore. A murmur of relief passed through them, and for the first time since they had left the mist behind, Jack saw a glimmer of hope in their eyes. They rowed harder, the promise of solid ground driving them forward, even as the last of their strength began to wane. The shoreline grew closer, the dark silhouette of trees and rocky cliffs rising out of the water like a beacon. By the time they reached the shore, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of deep purple and blue. Jack was the first to pull his boat onto the beach, his boots sinking into the soft sand as he climbed out. The others followed, their legs weak and unsteady after days at sea. They had made it. Jack scanned the beach, his eyes sweeping over the dark, unfamiliar landscape. There was no sign of civilization, no lights, no buildings, nothing but the dense forest that bordered the shore. But there was fresh water here, Jack was sure of it, and where there was water, there was food. Set up camp, Jack ordered, his voice firm despite his exhaustion. We'll rest here tonight and search for supplies in the morning. The men obeyed without question, too tired to do anything but follow orders. Jack watched as they gathered driftwood for a fire, their movements slow and deliberate, the weight of the journey still hanging over them. As the fire crackled to life, casting flickering shadows across the sand, Jack sat down on a nearby rock, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. He had led them here, out of the mist, away from the nightmare that had nearly claimed their lives. But now what came next? He didn't know. For the first time in his life, Jack had no plan, no goal, no treasure to chase. The sea of mist had taken that from him too. It had stripped him of everything, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back and the men who still followed him. But maybe that was enough. As the stars began to dot the sky above, Jack felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He had survived. They had all survived, and maybe, just maybe, that was the treasure he had been searching for all along. The journey wasn't turned over, not by a long shot. There were still many miles to travel, many dangers to face. But for now, Jack allowed himself to rest, to let go of the past, and to look toward the future with something he felt in a long time.